All right, so these are your biology notes for section 3 on Mendel and heredity. Your objectives in this section are to describe the patterns of inheritance that Mendel's data revealed, and then also to summarize Mendel's law of segregation. So first off, you got a couple definitions here. Traits are inherited characteristics, whether they be your eye color, the shape of a leaf, the length of a tail for an animal, right? It doesn't really matter what it is. If it's something that you see, a characteristic that an organism has, and they inherited it from their parents, it's a trait, right? And then genetics is the study of the inheritance of traits in organisms, variations in those traits in organisms. So we already watched a video over Mendel's experiments, or at least I hope we did. And you saw that there were certain traits that he was trying to keep track of with his pea plants, right? You had flowers of different colors, and he was trying to see how that was passed on from one generation to the next. And there were 3 key factors in that experiment that he did that helped him develop his laws of inheritance. The first thing that he did, that he had to do, was control the breeding, right? He had to know who the parents were, or there's no way he could have understood how things were passed on from one generation to the next. The second thing is he was using either or traits, right? If it's an either or trait, there's only 2 options. So it was either a purple flower or it was white flower, and then you get really clear results because there's no screwing that up. All they had to do was wait for the plant to grow up. If it had purple flowers, that's its trait, right? It's clear as day. And there was no mixture between the 2 traits. So when you mix the purple and the white, there wasn't some pink color in the middle or anything like that. So it was just those 2 options, definitely clear results. And then he also used purebred plants, right? His parent generation for both colors, purple and white, had forever and ever been purple or white, always, always, always. So he knew that they were purebred, that those were the only alleles that they could possibly have. We'll talk about that term later. But that there was no way that a white flower was going to show up with that purple purebred plant. So he could tell that any change that did come from his crosses came from his crosses and only from his crosses, right? It resulted from those crosses. So down here at the bottom, we do have a couple definitions here. Purebred is a line of parents allowed to self-pollinate long enough that they become genetically uniform. So they're always, always purple or they're always, always white. And then that cross is just a mating between 2 different organisms. So in his experiment, he had 3 generations. There was the parental generation, there was the first filial or F1 generation, and then there was that F2 generation. And his results that he saw in each generation were pretty key. In that first parental generation, you had purebred purple and you had purebred white. In the second generation, all the flowers were purple, but then in the third generation, white showed up again. Some were purple, some were white, but more specifically, there was that 3-to-1 ratio that's going to be pretty important, right? For every 3 purple flowers, there was 1 white flower. Right, the results in that third generation helped Mendel see that traits are inherited as discrete units since both colors were present and undiluted. That means that there's no in between. It's either purple or white. But even though white disappeared in that F1 generation, it came back up in the third generation. So we know that it was still there. It was just masked. It was hidden somehow. His conclusions from this experiment led to the law of segregation, right? And that law of segregation basically tells us that you inherit 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. And that second part of that, each parent only donates 1 copy of each gene to their offspring, which means that the 2 copies must segregate or separate during gamete formation. And we actually have already seen that, right? We talked about meiosis already and how you have homologous chromosomes that separate during that metaphase 1. Or excuse me, they separate during anaphase 1. So we know that you have 2 copies of everything. We know that you have those homologous chromosomes and that they separate in meiosis. But you got to understand that Mendel came up with all this stuff before we even knew what DNA was. Before we knew that DNA was what carried your genes and was the stuff that made you you. So it is actually it's actually amazing that he came up with this idea not even knowing how the actual mechanics of meiosis worked, right? We came up with meiosis way, way later, but he predicted exactly what would happen in that anaphase 1. Long before we even knew that anything like that could possibly happen. So it was a big step in genetics for us to know that we have 2 copies of each gene, 1 from each parent, and that since each parent is only donating 1 copy, they have to separate during gamete formation. There's only 1 copy per gamete, per sperm cell, per egg cell. All right, so that's section 1.